Roswell Desert. Based on real stories. Elliot Carter woke up that morning with an uncomfortable feeling, as if something invisible was watching him from the other side of the half-open curtain. The sun beat down palely on the cluttered desk of his Albuquerque apartment, reflecting off computer screens covered in yellowing notes and newspaper clippings. He couldn't tell if his obsession with conspiracy theories and unsolved mysteries had already eroded his sanity, or if, in fact, he was approaching something big. The sharp sound of the postman sliding a thick envelope under the door made him shudder. Elliot didn't expect anything that morning. He hesitated before picking it up, a strange feeling of nausea twisting in his stomach. As he turned the envelope over between his fingers, he noticed the absence of a sender. The only detail that stood out was a strange mark, like a stamp burned into the paper, a circular symbol filled with unknown inscriptions. Inside the package, there was a small external hard drive and a handwritten note on crumpled paper. The handwriting was shaky, as if whoever had written it had trembling hands or was scared to death. The truth is buried in the desert, but something escaped. Watch before it's too late. Elliot felt a shiver run down his spine. His instinct told him to throw that package away, forget it existed. But his curiosity, that damned need to know more, always spoke louder. He connected the HD to the computer and opened the only file inside it, a video named simply as Roswell 1947 Confidential. Pionto. The video started with a black screen and static hiss, but the image soon formed. Black and white footage, grainy, shaky as if it had been captured in a hurry. In the center of the scene, a humanoid body lay on a metal table, surrounded by soldiers and men in lab coats. Its features were undefined, but what bothered Elliot most was the way the being's skin seemed to move slightly, as if something was crawling beneath it. A muffled voice, coming from one of the soldiers, said something that chilled his blood. "He's still alive. My God, he's looking at me." The screen suddenly went dark. The video ended there. Elliot let out a breath he didn't even realize he was holding. His heart pounded. Who the hell had sent that? And why? Then his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered, without saying anything. On the other end of the line, heavy, distorted breathing filled his ears. Someone, or something, was there. "You've seen too much," the voice whispered, before the call ended. The silence in your apartment had never felt so heavy. Elliot Carter stared at the computer screen, his fingers still frozen on the keyboard. The mysterious call echoed in his mind like a distorted whisper, something that seemed to come from a place beyond human understanding. But he couldn't stop now. He needed to know. Taking a deep breath, Elliot reopened the video file, but this time frame by frame, trying to absorb every detail. The screen shook, and the electrical chirp sounded like distant whimpers, but soon the images became clear. The military laboratory looked rotten with time, with equipment scattered around and a smell of rust permeating the recording. Then, he saw something that made his skin run cold. The camera flickered as armed soldiers dragged a humanoid body across the cold floor. Its skin was not gray, as in popular myths about aliens, but a milky, translucent tone, almost looking like a sack full of pulsing veins. Suddenly, one of the scientists shouted something in despair, and the soldiers moved away. The body on the table twitched violently. What Elliot saw next made him recoil from the screen with a choked scream. Something tore at the creature's skin from the inside out, like a fetus trying to be born. But the shape that emerged was impossible to describe. The images shook, but he could see a glimpse of black eyes as deep as craters, and something whispering through the flesh. One of the soldiers tried to shoot, but the bullets had no effect. The creature's body absorbed the impacts as if it were made of liquid shadows. The soldiers began to scream, and then the camera fell to the ground, capturing only the sound of what sounded like bones breaking and the wet crunch of flesh being torn apart. Elliot stopped the video, feeling his stomach drop. He knew it shouldn't exist, but it existed, and he was now the only one with that evidence. Then, a notification appeared on your computer. Someone was trying to remotely access your files. The screen flickered, and before he could react, the video disappeared. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. Someone didn't want him to see that, but the worst was yet to come. A new email arrived. No sender. Untitled. Just one sentence in the message. "You shouldn't have seen that, Carter. Now they know that. You know." That night was long. Elliot Carter couldn't get the images from the video that had been deleted from his computer out of his head. He tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a virus, a hacker, a technical error. But he knew. Someone did this on purpose. Someone was trying to silence him. With his heart racing, he spent the night scouring the internet, trying to find any trace of the footage he had watched. But all he found were the same old stories about Roswell, lies polished to calm the public's curiosity. No true records, no evidence, until he heard the first strange sound. A sharp crack came from the apartment hallway. Something subtle, but enough to make your muscles tense. He took out his cell phone and opened the security camera app he had installed in the building weeks before. The images loaded slowly, and then his blood ran cold. Someone was standing in front of his apartment door. The figure was tall, slender, draped in an impeccable black suit. The camera was shaking slightly, as if something was interfering with the signal. Elliot tried to zoom in, but the man's face seemed absent. No defined features, just a patch of shadow where the eyes and mouth should be. The man didn't move. He just stood there, motionless, facing the door. Elliot held his breath and grabbed a knife from the kitchen. What should he do? Call the police? Lock yourself in the bathroom? Then his phone rang. The sound made him jump, letting the knife fall. Through the floor. Unknown number. Hesitantly, he answered, but remained silent. The breathing on the other end of the line was distorted, ragged as if it were coming from someone or something that shouldn't be alive. Stop while you can. The voice didn't sound human. There was a metallic hiss, as if multiple voices were speaking at once inside his head. Elliot turned to the computer screen. The camera now showed the empty hallway. The man had disappeared, but on the floor, right in front of her door, there was something that wasn't there before. A white envelope, exactly the same as the first. Inside, just a new message, written in shaky and misaligned letters. "You've already been marked. He will find you." Elliot Carter spent the early hours drinking coffee and going through old files looking for any clues about the events in Roswell. The warning he had received still echoed in his mind. "You've already been marked." But this only served to make him more determined. Someone wanted to silence him, and he needed to know why. It was then that he found a name that appeared in declassified records and on obscure internet forums. Daniel Grayson. Grayson was a retired ex-military man, one of the few who claimed to have been at the Roswell base in 1947. In old interviews, he talked about the bodies recovered, the cover-up operation, and the fear he saw in the eyes of the senior officers. But in recent years, Grayson had disappeared from the spotlight, as if he wanted to be forgotten. Elliot didn't hesitate. He found a phone linked to the ex-soldier's name and dialed it. He called 3 times. On Wednesday, someone answered. "Who? Are you?" Grayson's voice was hoarse, aged, but it carried something more. Fear. Elliot explained that he needed to talk about Roswell, about the filming, about what really happened that night. The silence on the other end lasted so long that he thought Grayson had hung up. But then the old man spoke with a haunted tone. "If you saw, then it's already too late for you." The journalist tried to insist, but Grayson just murmured, "They don't want the truth to be told. They're not from here. They never were. A loud sound like static mixed with a distorted scream severed the connection. Then just silence. Elliot tried calling again. Nothing. He tried to track down the ex-soldier's address. His home was in an isolated trailer on the outskirts of the Nevada desert. He decided to go there. The next morning, he arrived at the place. The door was open. The dry wind blew papers across the floor. Inside the trailer, there was no sign of Grayson. But Elliot found something that made his stomach turn. scratch marks all over the wall as if someone had desperately tried to escape. He called the police. The agents treated the case as an ordinary disappearance, but Elliot knew it wasn't. 3 days later, Grayson was found, or at least what was left of it. His body was lying in a deserted field, kilometers from his home. His face was a nightmare. His eyes were completely burned out as if something had charred them from the inside out. His mouth was no more, just a black, shapeless crack, as if it had been dilated until it ruptured, leaving only an empty hole where lips and teeth had once been. Next to the body, buried in the sand, the police found a single object, a broken military radio, which was still whispering static. Elliot pulled away, feeling the bitter taste of panic rising in his throat. Grayson tried to warn him, but now he was dead. Elliot couldn't explain it, but he felt like someone was watching him. And then he listened, a whisper coming from the broken radio. "You're next." Elliot Carter drove aimlessly, his fingers clenched on the steering wheel, his mind spinning with images of Daniel Grayson's body. Burnt eyes, torn mouth. The scene never left his head. The Nevada desert stretched out before him, an ocean of sand and darkness. The sun was beginning to fall, turning the sky a sickly red. He needed to think. I needed to understand what was happening before it was too late. That's when he realized. A black car followed him. The vehicle was coming at a constant distance, headlights low, no license plates. For a moment, Elliot tried to convince himself it was a coincidence, but then another black car appeared in the rearview mirror, occupying the other lane of the road. They were trying to surround him. Instinct screamed in his mind. Run. Without thinking twice, he accelerated. The engine of his old sedan groaned in protest, but the speed rose. The black cars responded immediately, matching his pace, sliding down the road like predators hunting prey. Elliot tried to maneuver, but the shadows around the road felt wrong. Something about them moved unnaturally, as if they were folding in on themselves. He blinked, his heart racing, and for a moment he was sure that the shadows had changed position, as if they had a life of their own. Then the car headlights went out. He looked in the rearview mirror. Nothing. The cars were gone. His chest heaved as he looked around. There was no way those vehicles would just disappear in the middle of the desert. It was impossible, or at least it should be. He slowed down, eyes scanning the road. The silence was absolute. No engine, no wind, just your rapid breathing and the frantic beating of your heart. Then, in the corner of his eye, he saw it. Something was on the side of the road. A tall silhouette, in a black suit, without a face. Elliot turned his head to look directly, but the figure was gone. Desperation rose in his throat. He knew he was still being watched. He accelerated again, his hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to leave that damn desert behind. But deep down, he knew. It didn't matter where he went. They would find him. Elliot Carter didn't remember how he got to the roadside motel. His mind was a confusing fog of distorted images and voices that weren't his. The room was small, suffocating, lit only by the neon sign flashing outside. He threw himself onto the bed, trying to catch his breath. His thoughts were fragmented. His hands were still shaking from what had happened on the road. The cars, the men in black, the shadows that seemed to move on their own. He closed his eyes for a moment, and then the nightmare began. He was standing in the middle of the desert, barefoot, his feet sinking into the cold sand. The night around him was an absolute void. No stars, no moon, no end. The air vibrated as if there was something alive beneath the earth, something breathing, waiting. In front of him, there was a twisted body on the ground. He tried to get closer, but the corpse moved. The thing slowly raised its head. Its translucent skin stretched tight over thin, brittle bones. The eyes were black wells that absorbed light, deep and endless. But what made Elliot's blood run cold was the voice. You already feel it, don't you? It was his voice. The creature opened its mouth unnaturally wide, and inside it, there were more eyes. Small, moving like maggots, all facing Elliot. The pain came suddenly, a horrible burning in his chest, as if something inside him was trying to get out. He fell to his knees, suffocating, choking on a thick, hot liquid that dripped from his mouth. Then, he woke up. But the pain continued. He lifted his shirt with trembling hands and swallowed a scream. His skin was different. Dark veins ran from his abdomen to his neck, pulsing beneath the surface like black roots. And right in the center of his chest, there was a bulge that shouldn't be there. Something small and moving. Elliot gasped, falling against the wall. This wasn't a nightmare. Something inside him was waking up. Elliot Carter drove without stopping, his face sweaty, his eyes sunken and red. The car radio hissed with flashing static, even when it was turned off. He didn't dare touch that button. Ever since he woke up in the motel, with dark veins pulsing. Beneath his skin, he knew he needed to escape. But escape to where? The answer came into his mind like a persistent whisper. Something that was not his own thought. Go back to where it all began. Roswell. The desert seemed endless, a lifeless expanse under a leaden sky. Heat wavered on the horizon, distorting the shapes of the mountains in the distance. But Elliot felt something else. Something was waiting for him there. Something old. As he entered the city, he felt a chill. Roswell seemed forgotten in time. The decrepit houses, the sun-worn signs, the few inhabitants walking the streets as if they were trapped in an eternal cycle of routine and silence. Suspicious looks followed him as he parked the car. He decided to go to one of the local bars, a small establishment with faintly blinking neon signs. When he entered, the room fell into a tense silence. The customers stopped talking, and the bartender wiped the counter as if he didn't want to recognize him. Elliot approached. "I'm looking for information about the base. The underground base." The bartender stopped rubbing the cloth against the glass and narrowed his eyes. Everyone in the bar was looking at him now. "There is no basis at all. Do you want to drink something?" replied the man, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I know it exists, and I know you know. I need to find her." The silence grew heavier. Elliot could hear himself breathing. An elderly woman sitting in the corner of the bar cleared her throat, without looking directly at him. "You're already marked, aren't you?" she murmured. Elliot felt his stomach drop. How do you know that?" She sighed, taking a sip of her drink. "I saw this before. I saw it happen to others." His trembling fingers slid across the glass, as if seeking comfort in the texture of the glass. "They come here, talk about the base, and then they disappear, or worse." Elliot swallowed. "What happens to them?" The elderly woman finally looked at him, and her eyes were filled with something worse than fear. Resignation. "They start to hear things, then see, then they stop being themselves." The bartender slammed a glass on the counter, making Elliot and the old woman startle. "You should go away, boy, before they know you're here." The journalist stood up slowly, his heart beating against his ribs. He already knew what he needed to do. If he wanted answers, he would have to go to the base buried in the desert. But before he could leave the bar, sound came from the old radio on the counter. A distorted metallic voice, impossible to decipher. "He's already coming." The signal sizzled and the radio turned off by itself. Elliot felt his skin tingle. He was no longer alone. Night engulfed Roswell when Elliot Carter took the dirt road toward the desert. The heat was oppressive, but the cold inside him was worse. Ever since he heard the metallic voice on the bar's radio, he felt watched, as if something invisible was following his every step. The car rocked on the uneven road, dust rising in thick clouds. According to the reports he had obtained, the underground base was on the outskirts of the old Area 51, buried under tons of sand and secrets. The government claimed there was nothing there. But Elliot knew how to recognize a well-told lie. After almost an hour of driving through absolute emptiness, he saw it. In front of him, a black hole in the earth, a metallic entrance partially covered by rocks and debris. The gate was half open, revealing a dark corridor leading down into the bowels. Of the base, he hesitated. Everything in his body told him to turn around and never think about that again. But he could no longer run away. The truth was already inside him. With a shaky flashlight in hand, Elliot descended. The base was abandoned, but not empty. The corridors were long and narrow, suffocating, and the smell of oxidized metal and something organic permeated the air. As he walked, the walls seemed to close in around him. It was then that he saw the cells, small metallic compartments, all open, empty, but marked. The cell walls were scratched with claws, deep grooves etched into the steel as if something had been desperately trying to escape. Elliot ran his fingers over one of the marks and shivered. The ends were burnt, charred, as if the hands that left them were not human. He continued, the absolute silence of the base only increasing his paranoia. The only sounds were his own breathing and a distant drip. It was then that he found the archives room. Stacks of documents were scattered on the floor, burned, torn, mutilated. Some pages were still legible, but what he read made his blood run cold. Biological fusion experiments, Phase 4, inconclusive results. Subject 07 showed resistance, but assimilation was successful. Transfer complete. Hostile entity in quarantine. And at the bottom of the page, hosts don't notice the change until it's too late. Elliot dropped the paper. His fingers trembled. Then, behind him, something scraped against the metal floor. He turned the flashlight reflexively. Nothing. But now there were marks on the floor, as if someone, or something, had been there just seconds before. And that's when he saw it. On the wall next door, someone had written a single word, in large, shaky letters, as if the author had used his own fingernails to carve it into the steel. Run. The air became thick. Something moved in the darkness of the hallway. Elliot Carter was no longer alone. The air inside the underground base felt dead. Elliot Carter moved through the rusty metal corridors, the flashlight wavering in his sweaty hand. The warning engraved on the wall, "Run," still pulsed in his mind, but his feet did not. Obey. Something was pushing him forward. Something wanted him to continue. The feeling of not being alone was unbearable. He heard soft footsteps behind him, but whenever he turned around, he only saw motionless shadows. Then, he found the room, sealed. A solid metal door, with signs of having been hastily welded together, as if someone was trying to keep something inside. On the side, a faded sign. Sector 7. Biological confinement. Elliot knew he should walk away, but his fingertips tingled, as if something beneath his skin was pushing him forward. With effort, he forced entry. The rust crunched, releasing a putrid smell that burned his throat. The flashlight torch cut through the darkness. What he saw made his mind reel. There was a body fused to the wall. At first, it looked like a mummified skeleton, wrapped in dried layers of skin and tissue. But then he saw the face, half human, half something more. The flesh was deformed, as if it had tried to change, tried to be something else. The skull appeared stretched, unnaturally elongated, and the eyes, sunken and dry, were too large. For a human, Elliot took a step back. The smell was wrong. It wasn't just decomposition, it was burnt, ferrous, alien. At the base of the wall, he found an identification plate corroded by time. With trembling fingers, he wiped away the dust. SGT. Daniel Grayson. The shock blocked his lung. Grayson? But he had been found dead in the desert. So who the hell was buried out there? Panic seized him and he staggered back. But the moment his breathing quickened, his body moved. The dry eyes opened. Elliot froze. It wasn't possible. It wasn't possible. The corpse's eyes fixed on him. And then he whispered, "He's inside you." The world spun. The flashlight fell from his hand. Elliot tried to scream, but something inside him moved. Something woke up. Time seemed to have stopped. The corpse fused to the wall still stared at him, its dry, sunken eyes shining amid the oppressive darkness of the underground base. "He's inside you." The words echoed in Elliot's mind like muffled thunder, ringing, not just in his ears, but deep within his bones. His body went cold, his muscles tensed in a horrible spasm. Then came the pain. A suffocating heat crept up her spine, as if an invisible thing was crawling under her skin. His chest was burning from the inside out. Elliot fell to his knees, panting, clutching his sides as his veins stood out like dark ropes beneath his skin. Something whispered in his mind. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was a noise that shouldn't exist. A metallic and wet sound at the same time, like a breath inside an empty skull. Elliot clutched his head tightly, trying to fight off the invasion, but the words came loud and garbled, in a language his mouth shouldn't have been able to pronounce. Akshar, Vailith, Zukara. The sounds meant nothing to him, but at the same time, he understood them. His eyes rolled. The darkness around him began to pulse. Elliot felt something inside him move. It wasn't physical, it was mental. As if a second thought, a second consciousness was awakening in the back of his mind. Something that wasn't him, something that was always there, waiting. He stood up but didn't feel his own legs move. His hands shook, but he wasn't the one who moved them. The body fused to the wall was still watching him and smiled. The whisper returned, stronger now, reverberating inside his skull. "You are no longer just one," Elliot gasped. His vision flickered. For a moment he saw his own reflection in the rusty metal of the wall. But it wasn't him. His eyes were too dark. And then, for the first time, he heard the other within himself. "I see what you see." The wind cut through the desert like invisible blades as Elliot Carter emerged from the underground base. But he didn't feel cold. Something inside him pulsed, vibrated, whispered. Ever since he heard that voice in his mind, every thought seemed shared, every memory fragmented. He was no longer alone, but I needed answers. He drove all night following the only lead he had left, Dr. Abraham Weiss, a former government scientist who had fallen off the radar decades ago. Some conspiracy forums claimed that Weiss had seen something he shouldn't have seen, and that he had since lived as a recluse on the outskirts of Santa Fe. Upon arriving at his destination, an isolated cabin in the middle of nowhere, Elliot realized that fear already lived there. The house was small, dirty, with newspapers covering the windows and strange symbols scrawled on the outside walls. It was the kind of place for someone who knew they were being hunted. He knocked on the door. No response. Tried again. Only after the third knock did he hear the click of a rifle being unlocked. "Go away." The voice was serious, worn by time. "I need to talk to you," Elliot insisted. "I know about Roswell. I know about the experiments. I know one of them survived." Silence stretched. The door opened just a crack, revealing deep, suspicious eyes. Weiss studied Elliot with a mixture of terror and recognition. "Good heavens," muttered the scientist. Elliot walked in, smelling a strong smell of mold and old cigarettes. Walls covered in notes, grotesque diagrams, blurry photos of bodies that didn't look entirely human. "You already feel it, don't you?" Weiss said, keeping her distance. Elliot hesitated. His chest burned, his head buzzed, and the feeling that there was another presence inside him was becoming more and more real. "What's happening to me?" His voice was hoarser than he expected. Weiss rubbed her face, as if trying to find the courage to say what came next. "In 1947, they didn't die in the fall. They survived. At least one of them." Elliot held his breath. "The government tried to contain him," Weiss continued. "He wasn't like the others. He was different, smarter, more patient." The scientist pointed to a hand-scribbled diagram showing a human brain connected to an unknown alien structure. "He didn't need a body to live. It needed a mind." The revelation hit like a punch in the stomach. "He fused with someone?" Weiss nodded slowly. "A soldier from the base, the first test subject. They studied it, isolated it, but never fully understood it. Then one day he disappeared." Elliot felt a chill run down his spine. What happened to him? Weiss held her gaze for a moment before saying, in a barely audible whisper, "He became something else." The journalist swallowed hard. His head throbbed. His reflection in the window seemed to move on its own. Elliot. Weiss tightened her fingers around the rifle. Whatever entered you was already waiting. The world seemed to spin. Elliot felt something inside him pulse, vibrate, smile. 'Cause now he knew he was next. Abraham Weiss's rifle was still trained on Elliot Carter, but it was no longer any use. Elliot fell to his knees, clutching his chest, his heart hammering as if it was trying to escape from within him. Something was wrong. His veins pulsed, dark, and thick beneath his skin, spreading like rotten roots. What is happening to me? His voice was distorted, as if it were no longer his. Weiss took a step back, eyes wide in horror. My God, it's already started. Heat rose inside Elliot, burning his spine, shooting through his limbs. His bones creaked, shifting beneath. His flesh as if something was trying to reshape him from the inside out. He shouted, but the sound that came out was not human. His body convulsed violently. He tried to hold the table, but his fingers felt different, longer. The joints shook, bending at wrong angles before returning to normal. He wasn't just changing, it was being redone. The mirror on the wall reflected something that wasn't him. His eyes were no longer brown. The white was gone, replaced by a deep, viscous blackness. The skin around his mouth felt like it was stretching, trying to open wider than it should. "Fight, Carter!" shouted Weiss. "You're still there. Don't let him take you." Elliot tried. He tried to hold back his own mind, keep himself inside his skin. But the other was already there, a crawling presence, immense and hungry, that pulsed within his thoughts, distorting his reality. Whispers in an impossible language echoed through his synapses, as if someone was rewriting his existence, word for word. "You are no longer just one." Elliot's blood bubbled like a living ocean. His breathing became ragged, heavy, his lungs taking in more air than they should be able to. Then, he laughed. But it wasn't him. Weiss squeezed the trigger. The shot went through Elliot's shoulder, sending him staggering back. But he felt no pain, just a shiver of pleasure. As if that meat no longer mattered. Weiss stepped back, shaking, the rifle falling from her hands. "No, it can't be." Elliot smiled, and for the first time he felt like he was no longer just seeing through his own eyes, but through something much bigger, something that was not of this world. Elliot Carter staggered back, panting, feeling the weight of the impossible sinking inside his body. Weiss's shot had stung for a second, but now there was no more pain. There was only him. Or rather, there was something more. The scientist was, still shaking on the other side of the room, his eyes wide in panic. "You're not you anymore," Weiss muttered. "I saw this before. I saw it happen." Elliot didn't respond. He couldn't, because something in his head was whispering. A slippery voice made of static and darkness, shaping itself into words that seemed to come from inside his own throat. "Look at yourself." His eyes wandered to the dirty mirror next to the door. Elliot took a hesitant step. His chin was still pulsing, the muscles in his face feeling wrong, as if his skin was no longer his own. He looked at himself. The mirror reflected what he should have been, but it wasn't. The face was almost normal, but the eyes weren't his. They were deep, black, impossible to decipher. There was no reflection in the pupils. The darkness inside went beyond the surface. And then, the reflection moved on its own. Elliot felt his blood run cold. He didn't move, but his reflection smiled. Not a human smile. A smile that was too long, too wide, as if his mouth was stretching beyond the limits of his flesh. The Elliot in the mirror tilted his head at an odd angle, watching him like a predator inspecting prey. And then, he whispered, "I am here." The sound didn't come from the glass, it came from inside Elliot. It came from your own mouth. He backed away, his back hitting the wall, his lungs seizing in a suffocating spasm. His reflection, however, remained there, motionless, smiling, until something beneath his skin began to move, a shapeless shadow like a faceless figure. pressed against his flesh from the inside, stretching the skin on his forehead, forcing it to expand as if something was trying to tear its way out, Elliot shouted. But the thing inside him just laughed. Elliot Carter walked out of Abraham Weiss's cabin a condemned man. His chest heaved, sweat ran cold down the back of his neck, and his mind buzzed with words that weren't his. Every thought seemed to be invaded by something immense, ancient and hungry. "I am here." The voice inside him echoed, vibrated, pulsed with his blood. But he was still Elliot. He was still human, and he needed to escape before he stopped being. He got into the car, his hands shaking as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared, and then he accelerated out of the desert, throwing dust into the air. I needed to get out of there. He needed to get back to any place where the shadows wouldn't follow him. But then he realized, shadows were everywhere. The streetlights along the road looked bent, smeared, as if something was crawling between them. In the rearview mirror, the night moved. Dark shapes danced in the corners of his vision, blurry, never fully visible. Elliot accelerated more. His bones ached. His chest throbbed with a pulse that wasn't his. When he finally entered the city of Roswell, something was wrong. There was no one there. The streets were empty, stores closed, not a soul alive. But he knew there must be people there. He had seen people before. He remembered them. The bartender, the old lady from the bar, the whispering voices of the residents. Now it was as if they had never existed. Streetlights flickered dimly, casting the wrong shadows on the sidewalks. Elliot got out of the car, knees shaking. The wind blew hot and dry, carrying a metallic smell that didn't belong in the desert. Then something caught his attention. The store windows reflected, but they didn't reflect him. His reflection was standing there, but it wasn't following him. He moved his hand. The reflection didn't move, and then he smiled. There's nowhere to run. The voice did not come from outside. It came from inside him. Elliot swallowed the scream. The entire city was empty. But was it ever full, or was he no longer in the same reality? Elliot Carter ran. But where? Roswell's asphalt dissolved beneath her feet. The streets crumbled into thick, dark sand, like ash from a fire that never ended. The city disappeared. He jumped back into the car, hands shaking as he turned the key, but the engine coughed once, twice, and died. The radio turned on by itself. Whispering static filled the car. "You were never here," Elliot gasped, getting out of the vehicle and running into the desert. The road disappeared behind him, swallowed by a liquid horizon that shimmered, like molten glass. The sky above wasn't right. The stars moved. They spun. They twisted like empty eyes watching every step he took. They weren't stars. They were holes. He tripped in the soft sand, falling to his knees. The desert was folding in on itself. Dunes appeared where there was previously flat ground. Rocks appeared and disappeared, pulsing as if time itself was fragmenting. Elliot looked at his hands. They were no longer yours. The skin flickered like a distorted reflection, as if there was something beneath it trying to take control. His veins glowed in shades that didn't exist. He looked at the horizon, but there was no horizon anymore. The desert repeated itself in impossible patterns, like a broken mirror reflecting pieces of a reality that didn't make sense. Each direction was the same. He was trapped in an endless maze of sand and shadows. "You already know what you need to do," the voice inside him whispered again. But now it wasn't just a voice. It was multiple, overlapping, all echoing inside his mind as if thousands of versions of himself were speaking at the same time. Elliot pressed his hands against his temples, trying to shut out the noise. But he knew. Reality was falling apart, and he no longer knew if he was still human. Elliot Carter fell to his knees in the sand that was no longer sand. She moved, breathed, pulsed like living flesh. Each grain seemed to attach itself to his skin, crawling, fusing with him. He couldn't fight anymore. Stop resisting. The voice inside his mind was no longer a distant whisper. It was real, gift, pulsating. It was him. Elliot opened his mouth to scream, but another sound came out. Not a scream, but a warped metallic laugh, reverberating within the folded desert around them. "No, I'm not you." He tried to argue, but the other voice was already speaking through him. "You were always me." Elliot felt his body stiffen, as if an invisible force was molding his bones into a new shape. His fingers twitched, bending beyond belief, but he felt no pain, because now he was feeling something bigger. His lungs expanded, the wrong way, his breath becoming an echo within himself. He was growing up, not physically, but mentally. His consciousness was stretching beyond what was human. He saw all. The moment of the fall in 1947, the bodies being dragged to the laboratories, scientists cutting out meat that shouldn't exist. And then, the escape. He felt hungry. The wait. The search for a new host. Elliot wasn't the first, but it would be the last. He tried to speak, but his mouth wouldn't move of its own accord. The truth needs to be told. The voice was no longer just his. It was multiple, overlapping, a cacophony of existences speaking through his throat. They never left. They have always been here. The desert pulsed around him. The stars spun. Elliot Carter smiled. But it was no longer Elliot. It was something much, much worse. Elliot Carter knew he was dying. Not the way a human dies. He still breathed, still saw, still thought. But with every second, less of Elliot remained. What was inside him expanded, stretching through his mind like the roots of a gigantic tree, swallowing memories, devouring thoughts, rewriting his identity. He needed to warn the world before it was too late. With trembling fingers, he took his cell phone out of his pocket and opened the camera. The screen reflected a face that was no longer entirely his. The skin was pale, translucent. The veins were black. The eyes were dark, bottomless holes. But there was still time. There was still one last fragment of Elliot in there. He pressed the record button. The screen was shaking. His breath came in low, hoarse gasps. "My name is Elliot Carter." His voice no longer seemed human, mixed with metallic tones, reverberating like an echo. He swallowed hard, his chest burning. The thing inside him was crawling, pulsing. They didn't fall. His nose started to bleed. They arrived. The desert around him shook. The sand twisted like living flesh. The thing inside him laughed. The camera captured his eyes blinking in the wrong directions, as if inside him there was more than just one being trying to look out. Elliot tried to say something else, but his mouth no longer belonged to him. Recording has ended. The phone slipped out of his hands and fell into the sand. His lips moved on their own, without his ordering. Now they will see. Elliot smiled, but Elliot was no more. Elliot Carter's cell phone was lying in the sand, the screen flickering, his latest transmission echoing through the void. But no one would come to save him. The sky above the desert changed. It wasn't just night coming. It was something wrong. The eye. Stars began to disappear. One by one, they were swallowed by a black cloak, as if something immense was moving between them. The sky wasn't getting dark. It was being erased. Elliot fell to his knees. His veins glowed a sickly dark hue, pulsing as if something was feeding within him. His chest burned. His bones creaked. "It's happening." The voice inside him was no longer a distant presence. It was, on every part of his body. His skull throbbed, and for an instant he saw what was not meant to be seen. An immense living structure floating in a vacuum, ancient and infinite. Empty eyes spread across its surface, staring at him, whispering. "Waiting," Elliot screamed, pressing his hands against his head. The entity within him was connecting. The desert shook. The sand split into black cracks, expelling a hot, rotten wind. This was no longer the human world. This was where they had always been. Elliot tried to run, but his legs gave out. Something invisible tugged at him, ripping away his consciousness, layer by layer. The entity no longer needed him. He was just a portal. His eyes rolled back. The thing inside him took control. Elliot Carter tried to hold his mind, but he was sucked into the void. The sky above was completely dark, and something came down from the shadows. Elliot Carter no longer existed. What was left of his mind floated in an ocean of darkness, fragmented, shattered, consumed by what had awakened within him. He was no longer a man. He was many. The sky above remained black like an endless void, where, once there were stars, now there was only a gaping hole for something much larger, something that was going through. Elliot's flesh pulsed, his bones snapped into a new shape. His fingers stretched, his joints bent beyond belief. He stood on legs that were no longer human. The transformation was complete. He opened his eyes, or at least the things that now occupied the space in his eyes, and the world around him seemed to breathe with him. The desert dunes moved like a lung expanding. The shadows that once lurked at the edge of his vision were now everywhere. The portal was open. They were coming. Elliot Carter, the journalist, the man, the human being, was just a forgotten name inside an empty shell. What now moved inside that body was something much older, much hungrier. He raised his head to the starless sky and smiled. The city was calm when Elliot Carter returned. The streets of Albuquerque were busy, neon signs were flashing, and people went about their lives as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. Elliot walked slowly down the sidewalk, feeling the world around him as if for the first time. The smell of the city, the heat of the artificial lights, the incessant hum of conversations, everything seemed different now. He didn't blink. His eyes roamed the room in the wrong way, taking in every detail. Studying. A man bumped into him in a hurry. "Sorry, man," he muttered, without even looking. Elliot turned his head to watch him. His neck moved too gently. He smiled. But it wasn't a human smile. Slow, millimetric, as if the skin of his face was being pulled by something invisible, testing the limits of the flesh. The man who bumped into him felt a sudden chill, a sudden dizziness as if something had passed through him. He turned, but Elliot had already disappeared into the crowd. He walked, taking in the world around him, feeling the voices, the minds, the bodies ready to be opened, transformed, shaped. The entity within him was in no hurry. The first host was complete. Now, they needed more, and no one would ever notice until it was too late, because Elliot Carter was already among us, and he wasn't alone. We are with him.